Dr. Hunter, thank you for that kind introduction. It was great. Andrew. Wife, so nice to meet you earlier today. Larry, your leadership, service in Israel bonds. I go back with Danny Naveh. We were just trying to figure out about how long. I think it's 34 years. Remember when Danny was the advisor to the late Misha Arens, and he was Secretary of Defense, our Minister of Defense. It's incredible to watch your leadership and see bonds grow, and things that you've done over the past year in particular, been amazing. I go back with Zev Rubenstein, Vice President of Development, 20 years, a little over 20 years. And there's so many friends here I can mention, but I just got to mention Glenn Siegel because he really, he really puts my age at the forefront because we go back almost 40 years, I think, Glenn and Darrell. I'd like, if you give another round of applause to your Counsel General here, Olivia. We've gotten to know each other over the past couple of days, and can say on behalf of all the diplomatic service, Toda Rabba, you're doing an amazing job. I'd like to introduce my staff, my Chief of Staff, Noam Musar, is a professional diplomat, and Aidan Drillings, my assistant advisor, and arranged this trip. Thank you so much. So do you believe in miracles?
Yes.
So the great philosopher, the great Scottish philosopher, David Hume, who Immanuel Kant said shook him from his slumber, gave a bad rap to miracles. And ever since the beginning of the 18th century, Western civilization has frowned on miracles. We've become exclusively men and women of science. If you can't prove it, it doesn't exist, right? So, many years ago, I was traveling in Andalusia, southern Spain. And one of the great commentators on the Bible, Nachmanides, lived in Toledo for some time. And I decided while I was visiting Toledo to study Nachmanides. And Nachmanides, who lived 600 years before David Hume, dealt with the question of miracles. And he said, supernatural stuff doesn't leave us believing. The real miracles are the ones we have to figure out, are the ones we can reason away, are the ones that we can ignore. And that brought me to a book by the American author James Michener. Everybody knows some of his more famous works, but he has a work called The Drifters. Little-known work. It's a beautiful novel. And in the novel, there are students who travel the world together, and one of them is Israeli. So they're talking about the 6-Day War. And they're talking about miracles. And of course, the students are men of science. They don't believe in miracles. And the Israeli says, well, I want to tell you about the 6-Day War. He says, 2,000 years from now, there'll be another generation of intellectuals, and they'll look back at the 20th century, and they'll get to the 6-Day War, and they'll say, how long did it take for the United States of America to lose in Vietnam? How long did it take the Soviet Union to lose in Afghanistan? And you want to tell me that the state of Israel, 20 years after the Holocaust, defeated 150 million enemies in 6 days? So they will explain, historians were speaking euphemistically. Each day stood for 100 years. It was really the 600 Years' War. And over 600 years, they managed to win. And reading Mishnah, I say to myself, hey, I hear Nachmanides talking about miracles in the course of history. You know where there were miracles recently? October 7th. I was interviewed a lot on October 7th, around the 1-year anniversary. And, the big question by the journalist was, so where was God on October 7th? And I responded by saying, my question is, where were we? Where was the army for those few hours? Those are questions I can deal with. Where was the world funding Hamas for years? I can look for answers. Those are answers. If I'm looking already on a spiritual level, I'll find the courage of our civilians who, in the face of an onslaught, raced into their cars from the synagogues where they were praying at 7 o'clock in the morning when they didn't even know what was going on. My sons-in-law, their friends, everybody just ran. Grabbed their rifles, whether they were in regular service or reserve duty, and fought. And people fought tooth and nail and drove these terrorists back. Where did they find the courage? I think when I peeled away all of the details, I find a miracle. Who put that in their hearts? The fearlessness, the courage, the belief that they can win. And I was thinking just 3 weeks ago when I was in the Oval Office, and here I am, President of the United States, the Prime Minister of Israel, Minister of Strategic Affairs, the Chief of our security agency, myself, and the military attaché. And opposite is the President and the Secretary of Defense, the Vice President, Secretary Rubio is on the line, and the National Security Advisor of the United States. And here I am, this kid from Scranton, Pennsylvania, whose father came to this country as an 8-year-old refugee. And I am bearing witness to a discussion between the Prime Minister of Israel. We didn't have a Prime Minister for 2,000 years. We barely had a local leader in a shtetl or a ghetto that lived in fear. And the President of the United States, speaking with such respect, and the Prime Minister of Israel is thanking the President of the United States profusely. And there's a discussion for an hour and a half with the most powerful people in the world. And here I am, this little kid. I'm saying to myself, I'm the bearer of a miracle. I don't have to look for the splitting of the Red Sea. This is a miracle. It's unprecedented in the annals of history that a people comes back to their homeland. And you are participants in a very big way in that miracle. $53 billion? $4.5 billion in the past year and a half? One of the signs of redemption, the rabbi says, was economic prosperity. It says it in the Talmud. Look it up. Sanhedrin, I believe 68. Page 1. You know, it says when the trees start growing fruits again, the trees start growing fruits again. Have you tasted the wine of the Negev desert? I mean, the Negev desert. Okay, we got great wine coming out of the Galilee. It's up in the mountains. But the Negev desert has award-winning wine. The greening of the desert, 87% of our industrial water is recycled waste. Leaders of the world. I've been traipsing around South America and Africa for the past, 12, 15 years or so. I've gone to the hinterlands of Nigeria, of Kenya, Ethiopia, the highlands. Everybody looks and says, if only Israel would come here and help us with our agriculture, we could be the breadbasket of Africa. I spent 3 years advising the government of Paraguay. It's the most fertile land in South America. And the president says to me, how could it be? We received independence in 1820. You got independence in 1948. Your GDP per capita is $50,000, ours is $5,000. How could it be? It's a miracle. It's a miracle. It's not miracle. It's a miracle. And you're participants in that miracle. You helped that happen. And arms embargo. I contributed more when other people were shrinking. But you know what the biggest miracle is? Listen to this, folks. You probably all know it, but sometimes the things we know the most, we forget. There's only one country, one developed country in the world that has replacement fertility. Did you get that? We're 3 generations after a Holocaust. 3 generations after a Holocaust. Our bubbies and zabies were raw material for lampshades. And we're the only developed country with replacement fertility. There is no country over 2.1. We're at 3. Way ahead, double everybody else. All right? Everybody's scratching 1.6, 1.5. The Far East. Japan was poised, I remember studying economics in the 90s, Japan was poised to overtake the United States. Well, they didn't. You know why? They have no working hands. They have nobody to work. They're fiercely nationalistic. They're not Europeans who allow all the immigrants in. China? Go visit China. Town after town after town, abandoned buildings because nobody to fill them up. And replacement fertility is not just an issue for 100 years from now when there's no people left. It's tomorrow, because as life expectancy goes up, there's nobody to pay for that. What happens? It's today if you don't have working hands. You don't have a future. And Israel, despite not 1 hour without terrorism, not 1 hour. We face terrorism, you only get the big stories. Let me tell you. The people I live with face terrorism every single hour of the day. Rocks and Molotov cocktails, and sky's the limit. And yet, one of the happiest countries. The resiliency, the courage. And you know, with all the demonstrations, pro and con, get them out now, get them out tomorrow, first end the war, back and forth, we're fighting with each other. We're a robust democracy. That's great. That's great. People are on the streets expressing themselves, pushing their opinions. And yet, we're full of life, zest and zeal, and confident in the future. So I just want to share with you a personal story. Because well, I think it's the most telling. It's personal, but I think it's most telling of the courage of our soldiers and the resiliency of our people. Resilience of our people, not resilience. Resilience. So, I get up from the shloshim, the morning period for my son. And I get a call to join the March of the Living this year. I had never been on the March of the Living. And, you know, I'll tell you that when you lose, I guess anyone, but I'll tell you from losing his son, my oldest son, my best friend, you have to make a choice. Every day is a choice. You get up in the morning, and sometimes you just want to put your face down on the floor. And you have to scrape yourself up. You have to make a choice. I'm going to continue. And when they called it the March of the Living, I said, gee, I'm trying to march the living. I'm trying to march myself. I said, you know what? I'm going to go. And it was a very interesting delegation of refugees from the Gaza envelope. People had survived October 7th, and they asked for two bereaved fathers to come to the delegation. Myself and Ilan Hamani, whose son Asaf was a division commander who was killed on October 7th. A real hero. And I had not met Ilan before, but we became very close friends. Instantly. You know, you say Mishpocha, right? Mishpocha. You meet another bereaved father. You know, it's the family of what we call Mishpachat Hashchol, the family of the bereaved. You know, it's an extended family. So we got to Auschwitz, and you know, the march is from Auschwitz to Birkenau. And at the entrance to Auschwitz is a crematorium, and there's a lot of commotion outside. Delegations from all over the world, and we walked into the crematorium. And there's dead silence. It's the kind of silence that you can't find anywhere outside of the crematorium. That's the kind of silence. The silence shouldn't come with a knife. We walked to the end of the crematorium, and there was the rubber pipe sticking out of the ceiling where the Zyklon B gas emanated. And everybody is standing there, you know, deep in thought. And suddenly somebody said, Yechiel, say Kaddish. And I tried to get a word out of my mouth, but I couldn't. I couldn't say Kaddish. I couldn't say anything. I was just tongue-tied. And then somebody came over and put an Israeli flag over my shoulders and tied it in front of my throat. And Dani from Be'eri, from Kibbutz Be'eri, who was an 86-year-old survivor, a survivor of the Holocaust, he's 86, and a survivor of October 7th, he showed me how he held on to the door handle of the secure room to save himself and his wife. And Danny shakes a little bit. And he showed me how he held on to the door handle for 15 hours so that the terrorists couldn't get in. And he came with tears streaking down his cheeks and he said, Yechiel, please, we don't know by heart, say Kaddish. And I still couldn't talk. And Ilan came up to me, the father of Asaf, and took my arm and said, Bevakasha mincha, please, say Kaddish, I'll say it with you. And I started Yitkadal, Yitkadash, and I could barely get the words out of my mouth, and I made it through, and everybody said it with me. And as we left Auschwitz to march to Birkenau, I tried to make sense of what I was experiencing. What was it that got me so tongue-tied? And you know how you have experiences in life where there are thoughts that flash in nanoseconds? You have to make sense of them, the pictures and thoughts. And I was trying to put them in order, make sense. And I realized that what got me stumped, the reason I could barely breathe, let alone get a word out of my mouth, is because I didn't know what Kaddish to say. I was saying Kaddish for my son. His oldest boy is 10, 11. He loves basketball. He didn't want to say Kaddish. So am I saying Kaddish for my son in the crematorium? My son led forces into Gaza. He had spent 15 years in special ops. He had trained with the Delta Force. He led operations over the borders of Israel that are still classified. Is that, I say Kaddish for him in a crematorium? He wasn't helpless. He didn't depend on all the nations of the world for support when they were all quiet. Or do I say Kaddish for my father's family? I grew up with no cousins on my father's side because they were all exterminated. Do I say Kaddish for them? Is it the same Kaddish? And I was walking and thinking in between Auschwitz and Birkenau. I thought about miracles. I remembered Nachmanides, David Hume. I remembered James Michener, the Drifters. I remembered the 6-Day War, and I remembered my Aliyah. I remembered my choice in life to be part of this miracle called the State of Israel. And I remembered that when Moshe started basic training, he came home exhausted after trekking. They go on these long hikes with 60, 70 kilograms on their backs for hours and hours, all night. And one time I said to Moshe, how do you do it? How is it that you don't collapse under the weight? And he said, Abba, I developed a patent. I said, what's your patent? What do you mean? He said, I add weight. I said, what do you mean you add weight? It's not joshing me around. He always had this smile on his face. Abba, I add weight. I said, what do you mean you add weight? I said, Abba, I add all the prayers, the tefillot of my bubbies and zaydis throughout the years, throughout the generations. I add them to my shoulders. And as soon as I put them there, the weight goes down. I can bear the burden. That was the first thing I remember. In trying to make peace of the Kaddish. And the second thing I remembered was, he had once brought my parents a picture of him coming out of an attack helicopter. He's coming down on a rope. It was a classified picture. We brought it to my mom and dad. And my mother hung it up in the dining room where my father, when he was on his last days, weeks and months, he'd sit there opposite the picture and he'd study the Talmud. He was a psychologist, but before that he was a rabbi. He loved the Talmud. That was his peace of mind during the last weeks of his life. And I noticed that he would study the Talmud, and every once in a while he'd pick up his head and look at the picture of his grandson coming out of the helicopter. And he would smile and go back to the page of the Talmud. I saw him do it a few times. And I said, Dad, what's going on here? You pick up your head from the Talmud, you look at Moshe coming out of the helicopter, you smile, you go back to the page of the Talmud. And he said, you don't understand? You don't understand? You see this page of the Talmud? My father knew by heart. My grandfather knew by heart. His grandfather, all the way back to the writing of the Babylonian Talmud, my grandfathers knew this page. They all studied this page of the Talmud. But not one of them had a grandson. It comes out of an Israeli helicopter, wearing an Israeli uniform, going to protect and defend, to fight on behalf of the Jewish people of the State of Israel. It's a miracle that we have sons and daughters like that who protect and defend state of Israel and the Jewish people. And you're taking part in that miracle. So I'm taking the liberty of requesting something that I think if my son was standing here today, he'd request of you. It's what I requested myself, so I'm at liberty to request it of you. When the Prime Minister called me and said, would you take this position in Washington? I had refused a whole bunch of other things for years. So I didn't want to go back into public life. But when he asked me, it took me about 30 seconds to say yes. Because I felt my son telling me, you got to march of the living, Dad. You got to continue going. Get up and do more for my people. That's what he was saying to me in one ear when the Prime Minister was talking to me in the other ear. So I am going to take the liberty to ask you. You do a lot. You do a lot. You do so much. I'm just going to ask you to do a little more. Just add something. If it's another bond, or if it's another neighbor buying a bond, or if it's another organization, or another municipal fund or a state fund, do more. Because there's a whole generation of miracles out there embracing your support that need you and are counting on you. Thank you.